Hi, it's Mary Ellen with IT in Canada, and I'm here today at the ITU Greening ITC conference in Montreal, speaking with Stephen Harper, who is the Global Director of Environment and Energy Policy for Intel. Stephen, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with me.
My pleasure, thank you.
Stephen, Intel has been involved in all aspects of sustainability, greening its own operations, in product development, and in education. How do you account for what seems to be a culture of sustainability at Intel? Where does this come from, and how do you nurture it?
Well, I think it started organically back in the beginning of the company because one of our founders, Gordon Moore, has always been a very committed environmentalist, and the Moore Foundation that he heads now is one of the larger foundations in the environmental and sustainability area. So I think it was built into the DNA of the company early on. I do think that what's happened over time is we've got more systematic about it, and we've tried things. We've worked in this area, that area. I think in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've really looked at it more holistically. And in some cases, we've found that we can very, not easily, but very demonstrably align our profitability and our sustainability. In other areas, there's a little bit of an economic price to be paid, like for green energy. But we've gotten pretty good at it, and I think more and more senior management sees that doing well and doing good tend to align more often than not.
And that's the message we should be sending. If you think about green activities, all the green activities that Intel is engaged in, where do you think you can have the most impact? I'm thinking about your digital energy and sustainable solutions campaign, for example. Is there a specific initiative that you would like to point to that's gaining traction or has a lot of potential?
Well, I think of all the things that I've been involved in, DESC, Digital Energy and Sustainable Solutions campaign, as you referenced, is the area where we can have the biggest leverage, because it's not just Intel's technology, it's our partners' technology. Many of the other ICT companies, other companies that have ICT embedded in their solutions. So it's not just Intel, but that's where our technology out in the marketplace can have a multiplier effect compared to if we simply focused on our own operations. We have to do both. But I think more and more we're starting to look at how we can multiply the impact through our products in the marketplace as well as what we're doing, on our own. But the two are related, because if all we're doing is activities like DESC, which do involve ultimately selling more product, and we're not tending to our own knitting back in our own operations, then I think we could be accused of greenwashing or not really walking the walk. And so you have to do both, but increasingly we're looking at ways to have an impact with our technology in society.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of the multiplier effect, because one of the ways that commentators often think about that is through greening the supply chain. And I think in cases like Intel's, your very large vendor, you can have a very, very significant impact. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about Intel, and do you have a formal program that requires suppliers to meet certain criteria? And I guess the second question, if you have the patience for it, is what are the challenges to implementing green supply chain?
Well, yes, we do have a formal program, and it's gotten more formal and it's gotten more fleshed out over time. And increasingly, we've tried to work with others across the industry because, we're a supplier as well as a customer. And if we're getting different requests from a dozen different customers, that's a pretty inefficient process. Likewise, if we're doing that to our suppliers along with other chip companies. So fairly early on, we helped establish something called the EICC, It's the Electronics Industry Citizenship Council, I believe is what the acronym now stands for. And that, among other things, is a vehicle to try and standardize the collection of information in our supply chain so that you can compare apples to apples, and it's done on a fairly consistent basis. But we do add on a layer that's Intel specific. One of the challenges we face is we are, among the top 5 brands in the world in terms of, consulting firms that go out and figure out what the value of a brand name is. I've always been mystified by how they do that, but we're a very easily identifiable brand, and because of that, on issues whether it's environment, sustainability, labor standards, there is a lot of pressure on a brand like Intel to be better than the best. Because if groups that are concerned about social, labor, environmental issues, particularly in the developing world, want to make an impact, it is by spotlighting a brand that everybody knows. Apple has had issues of late with that. And so that's bred in us an extra layer of engagement. We do audits, we work with our suppliers, particularly in China where a lot of our supply chain is. We work with Chinese companies to train on best practices, to try and elevate things. So the challenges include just having more spotlight because of the nature of the brand. One of the other challenges, not just for Intel but other companies in our industry, is what was referenced earlier today in one of the presentations: the complexity of the supply chain. And we found that very recently with a non-environmental issue, but has been one of our top priorities, and that's conflict minerals. The automobile industry, the jewelry industry use a lot more conflict minerals, the minerals that could be conflict minerals, than we do in electronics. But again, because of the brand value, our industry's been a target. And the issue for us has been there's so many layers in the supply chain between, say, an Intel and the mine that the minerals come from in the first instance. And there's traditionally been very little visibility all the way down to the mine mouth. And of course, to the extent that those minerals are coming from the Congo, people are shooting. So it's a little bit hard sometimes to get to the mine mouth and figure out where your minerals are coming from and whether it's a good mine or a bad mine. But it's been a priority for us to drive our supply chain to be conflict-free. And so that's an example, as we speak, of an effort that we've helped to drive to pierce, all those veils, working with governments, the UN, the U.S. State Department. Industry can't do it alone, but working to find a solution so that we can reliably say our products are made conflict-free without doing what people tend to do, which is go and get your minerals from Australia or from Canada where you know that there was no involvement of an African mine, good, bad, or indifferent. That's a bad situation because that punishes, the good miners as well as the bad actors. So that's an example as we speak of something we're working on and a challenge we're facing.
Mm-hmm. You referenced a new initiative in your presentation this afternoon, which is Intel's ICT for Sustainable Energy Partnership. I'm wondering if you could give us a quick overview of the goals and what sort of progress there's been to date.
Well, ICEP is going to be announced formally in Rio at the Rio conference, and it really is building on what we've done through DESC. DESC has been active in the U.S., in China, and to some extent in India, and we've learned a lot. ICEP is basically taking DESC and partnering with other organizations like the Climate Group, for example, which is a major international NGO based in London, with the UN Foundation partnering ideally with 5 or 6 different organizations to build a global platform focused on how ICT can help drive energy efficiency and better resource management. So the objective is to create this global platform to basically capture best practices, capacity building capabilities, but then the real work's going to be done in a handful of countries which have yet to be identified because we're still pulling it together. But we'd like to get a mixture of developing countries and developed countries. Countries with large markets. We need an interested and committed government partner locally, companies from the market, NGOs from the market. And what we'll be doing in each of those country projects is working with the government in the region to develop policies that ideally will result in more use of ICT for energy efficiency, more use of ICT for resource efficiency, and they will look different. The projects will look different in the different locations because the needs will be different, the partners will be different, the barriers will be different. So developing country challenges are different than developed country challenges. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
It does answer my question, and I have one final question, if you don't mind, and it sort of follows from your discussion. Part of the issue for developing best practice is developing standards that people can use as they're investing and as they're planning. I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts on why it's so difficult to put standards in place for ITC use in smart grids and in other energy solutions.
I would actually flip the question around. I think it's not too hard, it's too easy. Part of the problem we have is too many standards, right, which essentially means no standard. And I'm not a standards person. I play around on the edges of the standards world. I often think of the standards world as kind of a parallel universe. And there are so many standards bodies. You know, within the United States, there are many standards bodies that are looking at the smart grid, for example. Internationally, there are even more. And everybody has a vested interest in pursuing their line of standardization. And the difficulty is in getting true standardization across the different standards organizations. You know, one of the reasons why the IT industry has been so successful is because we have been successful at developing standards of interoperability and other types of technological, and sometimes not even through standards bodies, just through more informal, you know, Bluetooth as an example. Once you involve the formal standards world, then you get a lot of competing agendas. And you know, I'm reasonably optimistic that with respect to the smart grid, we're heading in the right direction. But it's taking longer and it's messier than I would have expected. I think largely because of how many people you have, how many organizations you have basically trying to carve out turf.
Mm-hmm. And jurisdictional issues too, I think, actually. Yeah. Stephen, thanks so much for your insight today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.